Alright, so we're done with the chapter now, and there's not too much to say, because, like, outside of how I feel about the characters and, like, the story of the chapter overall, it doesn't really relate to the overarching plot, so this should be relatively quick. So, obviously the chapter talks in, like, terms of flashbacks and stuff, but I'm gonna go in, like, order, just to make sure you all know what happened when. So way in the very beginning, you have Wan Chi and Wan Shu, his hot-ass mom, and they escape Kowloon, and they meet Melvi on the transport on their way to Babylonia. And during the process of escaping Kowloon, Wan Chi got injured, and he was also just like a sickly child. So when they got back to Babylonia, he was put into the Star of Life, and then he fell into a coma. Wan Shu is a scientist who was studying construct minds and how they interacted with human brains. That's not really important. All you need to know is that she studied people's brains, and she used that expertise to try and find a way to wake Wan Chi up from his coma. So, of course, none of her plans worked, and eventually she stumbled across some records of, like, Chrono experiments where they were experimenting on, like, prepubescent children and turning them into constructs, and she was like, oh, well, you know what, I'm messing around with my kid, and he is also super young, so maybe this will be some kind of avenue to find out a way to wake Wan Chi up. Obviously, this was, like, highly illegal, and eventually it just, it didn't work for her because, like I said, it's highly illegal, so she had, like, no resources to pursue that lead further. But because Chrono has infiltrated everywhere, someone on the surface got a hold of those reports about child constructs, and they decided to continue that on the surface. And when they were talking about the labs being attacked by corrupted, it wasn't actually corrupted, it was them trying to convert the children, and then the children would go corrupted, kind of like how we saw Theodore, later on in the lab where he went corrupted with Pikmin. Basically, it was that happening, but like all over the surface. So Dr. Chiron, he is one of those scientists that was working at one of those research labs, and after he learned they were experimenting on children, he burned down the lab, stole the data, and took it back to Babylonia. And he was threatening to expose the entire system as a lie, that they were experimenting on kids, and that consciousness recall was also fake. And if you don't remember what consciousness recall is, that is a plot point from like the very beginning of the game, where they tell constructs, go out there and fight your hardest, because even if you die, we can just re-upload your consciousness into a new body, which is of course fake. They can't do that. You die, that's it. So eventually their research unit gets shut down, and Melvi is like super guilty about what she did, so she transfers to the Star of Life. Wan Shu gets approached by Chrono, and they want her to continue her research on the surface. And so she leaves Wan Chi in Melvi's care, and then she goes, to the surface. She's working with Chrono, managing the children, the test subjects, and while she's there, Pikmin is also there, right? He's also recruited to help work with the experiments, because, where there's children, there's Pikmin. And side note here, do you know how evil you have to be a villain in 2 backstories? Elisa and Wan Chi? That is crazy. Pikmin is a different type of evil. This is supposed to be like the beginning of Pikmin's, Utopia mind fusion experiments, because after they convert Aviana and Theodore, he connects Wan Chu's mind to the children. And the reason he used Wan Chu is because she spent the most time hanging around the kids. And you remember back in 25, the more time you live in an environment with the people you're fusing with, the better the fusion goes. So, their minds get connected, and because Wan Shu had already tried to connect herself to Wan Chi previously, when Aviana and the other kids were connected to her, she was connected to Wan Chi, so then all of them were connected. And now all of the children and Wan Shu and Wan Chi all have access to this like shared space that they stay in, and she uses that space to teach Wan Chi and the kids, but like mostly Wan Chi, about the world and give him like knowledge, right? She's like speed running school for him. So by the time he wakes up from his coma, he has, all of this knowledge that he wouldn't have had. So obviously, at some point, Wan Chi realizes that this is like really bad and she probably shouldn't be killing kids. Oh my god, crazy statement right there. But she stages a rebellion, the kids burn down the lab, and, that's that. She's killed by Pikmin, and then, that's why she quote-unquote disappeared. So then back on Babylonia, we have Wan Chi. He wakes up, and, Melvi is just taking care of him for the time being, and because Melvi was once a part of Wan Chi's team, and Pikmin was, of course, in Babylonia, he's still looking into any part of Wan Chi's old, research life, and he sets his sights on Melvi, and so she throws him to the youth center so that, he's away from her, and he'll no longer be a target for Pikmin. So, he's there, he's living his life, there with his friends, they're going about their business, he meets his friends, and eventually they grow up, they begin choosing their career paths, and him and Pello get blocked by this scandal that's going on in the background. That's a very quick subplot, and I mean it is less than a single node where they talk about this, but there's just people who dislike the fact that Babylonia is being run by Gestalt, and they want more power for themselves, average capitalist stuff, and so they try to use the kids as a scheme to subvert Gestalt's authority, but it's literally never ever referenced outside of that one node, so I didn't put that in there. So side note here, I probably could have made this more clear, but when I was talking about Wan Chi and Pello and wanting to save their moms, and saying Pello wanted to save his mom from stasis, Pello's mother died when he was a kid. Back when Chiron tried to save the constructs in the hospital, and Wan Chi was your mom's dead. His mom died back then, but he doesn't want to acknowledge it. That's a big theme of the chapter, is not acknowledging reality, and that's where Pello was. He didn't want to acknowledge that his mother died. The same way that Wan Chi didn't want to acknowledge that his mother wasn't coming back, because he wanted to go to the Earth to find her, but deep down he knows if he goes to Earth, he's not going to find her anywhere. So, it's two boys who are both living in their own little delusional realities, thinking, they'll still find their mothers, quote unquote, somewhere out there in the world, when they definitely won't. That's probably my one regret. I wish I made that a bit more clear. They do their thing. They set their fireworks off at Gestalt, meet Shorthalt. Wan Chi learns that Melvi went to the surface, and while they're on the surface, Melvi died. He gets his pep talk from Shorthalt, and then he decides, okay, well, I'll just be a doctor now since, all my friends are gone. My mother figure is also gone. I'll just be a doctor. So he does that for a couple of years. He joins Construct Maintenance, befriends Chiron. He learns about Construct Recall being fake. So he goes to the surface, and he's just living his life. He ends up in a battle where he meets this really weird corrupted that Pello saw. And the weird corrupted that keeps showing up is the robot that Wan Chi gave the children. The reason it keeps showing up is because it's tracking the chip that was inside of Wan Chi's head. So that robot shows up, and it kind of sparks some of these memories that are in Wan Chi's head. Aftermath of the fight, Wan Chi's on the brink of death. He becomes a construct. They remove the chip from the back of his head, and with it goes all of the memories. But the memories are still buried deep within his brain. So even if the chip is gone, there's still residuals in his head. He goes his life, he lives his life, and then he gets this mission. He goes to the lab. They're exploring the lab, and then that same corrupted, because it could no longer track the chip because the chip was removed, it went back to the lab, and then it found Wan Shi again, which is when it like dragged him into the darkness. It brought back all of these memories, all the flashbacks that we saw talked about in the beginning. They meet Rosetta, who was just exploring as part of the advanced team because it just happens to be in the area. She meets up, she helps Commandant and Wan Shi. They explore the lab, they learn about Short Halt being there. Commandant helps Wan Shi not die from mind deviation. They go down, they beat up Short Halt, and then they leave. So this chapter is really kind of like Echo Aria in the sense that like 60% of it is all flashback. But unlike Echo Aria, instead of it being like, we walk 10 feet, have a flashback. We walk 10 more feet and have another flashback. It's 10 straight nodes of flashback all at once. But that also kind of means that you forget what's happening on the outside in reality, which is also kind of funny. But also the chapter is super long, like Cinderburns. But it's not long because there's stuff happening. It's long because it describes everything in the most excruciating detail. Like instead of being like Wan Shi gets up and goes to get ready and then leaves, it's like Wan Shi wakes up. He steps his left foot out of the bed. He walks to the fridge. He gets food out of the fridge. He makes breakfast. It's kind of like that. That's why the chapter is super long-winded. So I cut a massive amount of dialogue, but it's that kind of dialogue that I cut. It's just those super extra details that you don't really need. So like a lot of really small conversations between like Chiron and Melvi, Chiron and Wan Shi and Melvi. They have really small conversations like that. But yeah, this chapter definitely makes Wan Shi like my favorite of the Strike Hawks. But like, I don't think that's a very hot take, considering Chrome's last like chapter interaction was like 10 chapters ago. Way more than 10 chapters ago if you count all the floating records and all the extra chapters and stuff. But yeah, like Chrome hasn't gotten any love in forever. Kamui has never gotten any love. So, makes sense that Wan Shi's got like the best development so far. Like I said, I really do enjoy the theme of having to like face reality. It felt good for Wan Shi. Like, of course, it kind of feels like it comes out of nowhere, but that's because he's got no development so far in any of these chapters, so they have to shill everything into one chapter. But it was good. I think they did well. As for anything that might be of relevance in the future, currently, Wan Shi has brain damage, and he's kind of working alongside some researchers to figure out maybe a way to fix the brain damage. And if they do find a way to fix his brain damage, it makes me think they might find a way to help Liv. And if they find a way to help Liv, then she can get back into Imperia. So then finally Liv can drop out this Eclipse frame that has been carrying her since chapter 1. Yeah, I don't really have too much else to say about it, besides my talk about the characters. Because, Wan Shu, I like Wan Shu because I just think she's pretty. But as for her, character, it's not like she's super deep or, layered or anything. She's a mother who wanted to protect her kid, and then a little bit of that maternal instinct branched out towards some other kids. And, she gave her life to save them, and then she died. Doesn't exactly take a lot of reading comprehension to get, what her whole MO is. Melvi, kind of the same way. She didn't care about the kids, she took care of Wan Shi for a while, and that sparked, a desire within her to protect children. And that's kind of how, literally, every character in the chapter was. But, yeah. It's kind of like a short, sweet chapter. Very self-contained. But I do like how it kind of hinted back to Cradle Parade, because at the end of Cradle Parade, you get that weird message that's like, the Parade of the Dead continues on, and it doesn't make any sense, but then you realize it was talking about Short Halt. Short Halt's parade is what was going still. It's just that nobody knew. So I think that was a really cool callback. Let me know how you feel about the chapter, but as for me, that's all I got. I don't know how to make outros. Bye.